Good morning, right before the lunch. I'm happy to be your guest today. Came all the way from Rotterdam. It was quite busy on the way, but right on time. It's good to be back here. I hopefully have a challenging story to you. I recently finished my 30th book. It's called Embrace the Chaos. I couldn't translate it in the first slide, so I will do it anyhow. What does it mean to you? I hope it will be a compelling story. Over the years, I turned into a scientivist. So I'm proud to be a scientivist and an activist. After having done my master's and PhD on climate change, already 32 years ago, I decided after a serious biking accident that it was enough. I only shared my knowledge within the scientific arena. And I asked myself, what is my impact? And within that scientific arena, I think I had some impact, but not in the economic and the societal arena. So one of my challenges to you today is also to turn into a scientivist. Share all the knowledge and the deepest feelings with as many people as possible. Before that, I would like to present my view of what's going on in these fascinating times at the macro level. Then I give some splendid examples of the theme of your conference, Building with Nature, and then I make it very personal. If it works, the technology, yes. Crisis as a chance. Well, a famous statement, there is some delay, I think, yeah. The famous statement that I used already more than 10 years ago is, we do not live in an era of change, but in a change of era. I hope you recognize this, because 10 years ago people still ask me, what do you mean with it? Well, what I mean with it is we are living in revolutionary times, perhaps best comparable with the 19th century. In the 19th century we had the Industrial Revolution. Now we are living in a digital and sustainable revolution. And that means a fundamental reorientation in the way we think, in the way we act, and the way we organize things. And like in the 19th century, that's a cumbersome process that had taken this, let's say, period, decades, almost 50 years, and I expect the same in this era. In times of chaos, there is decay and build-up. We love building up things. We don't like so much the decay, but I personally like the decay as much as the build-up. Look at companies that are suffering, like Shell. Oops. I didn't do anything. Yes. Like Shell, like Tata Steel, like Philip Morris, but also the governments are suffering. We've seen the same patterns in the 19th century with different companies and different governments. It was quite similar. But look what's being built up. Philips turned into a healthcare company. ASML arose within Philips. There are all kinds of movements, corporations that arise, like in the 19th century, but it's going way faster now than almost 150 years ago. I started my career as a mathematician. And as a mathematician, you learn the beauty of chaos. Most people dislike chaos because they associate it with a lack of insight and overview. But as a system scientist, you know that chaos is an order that we still don't know. And chaos paves the way for radical change. Any kind of system likes the equilibrium because it's highly efficient. But chaos is a period in between equilibrium. And that means That is, if a system really wants to change, you need chaos. You need to leave the equilibria because there are many things changing in your surroundings. And then you are looking for new attractors. And that's exactly the period where we're in. But chaos means a relatively short period in between two equilibrium. But relatively short can last 10, 15, 20 years in society and our economy. So people have the feeling that we live in a semi-permanent crisis. Let's look back 15 years. We started with a financial crisis that turned into a bank crisis, turned into a migration crisis, the corona crisis, the geopolitical crisis. In the newspapers this morning, we are speaking already of an energy crisis because of the strategy that Rusland is unfolding. What's next? Well, what might come next is, I skipped this one, a new economic crisis, because we are, let's say, stacking our debts. The debts are rising faster than ever. That holds for households, companies, governments. The climate crisis is unavoidable. Many of you might already speak of a climate crisis. I do not really agree with that. I think that we will see a climate crisis that will have way more impact than the corona crisis. I read an interesting report, what could be the economic damage of a climate crisis compared to the corona crisis. The outcome was twice as much, let's say, economic growth, but then less, let's say 4-8% less growth for the next 30 years. So I decided to put it on Twitter and LinkedIn, and nobody responded. So one crisis at a time. The resources crisis, I'm already warning for that. There will be many conflicts on, in particular, critical metals. I also read this morning there is now an explosion in terms of the need for solar panels. In Belgium, in the Netherlands, there's only one problem: we cannot deliver them. Because we need particular microchips in the Netherlands, omvormers, and they come from China. So the energy crisis is really depending on the resources crisis. And I personally expect a social crisis, the revolt of the middle class, like we have seen in the 19th century. The populism arose in the 19th century. The ordinary people protested against the elite. In 2019, before Corona, millions and millions of people went onto the street because of a variety of reasons, because of growing social and economic inequality, because of discrimination, because of mass migration, because of climate change. This was already a sign of the times. And we can expect much more. If you zoom into the Ukraine war, apart from the fact that this is a humanitarian disaster, but it's also a wake-up call for the Western countries. We have, over the last decades, been addicted to gas, in particular Russian gas. We are fully dependent on that. The panicking signals that we need to get rid of the Russian gas within 1 or 2 years are nonsense. It's not as easy as the politicians, let's say, speak about it. It might take at least another 10, 15 years. So, in the first instance, it's a negative signal. It's a fossil rebound. It's a setback again to coal, oil and gas. And that's always the immediate response to a crisis. So the geopolitical independency now goes at the cost of the sustainability. There are 3 major pillars now determining the energy transition: geopolitical independency, and sustainability and, let's say, energy security. But the good news is it will lead to an acceleration of the transition to renewables. Not within, let's say, the next 2, 3, 4 years, but after that it will lead to an explosion. After all these years, I remain optimistic. The practice is, for instance, in the Netherlands, if we want to establish windmills at the North Sea, a windmill park costs now 8 years. 8 years between the original ideas and the implementation. And we might accelerate that with a factor of 2 or 3. A couple of months ago, the IPCC report came out of Working Group 3. Again, a time bomb. I've been around for 10 years within the IPCC, and I was happy to be a member of the first IPCC committee. And 32 years ago, we came out with our first report, basically with the same message. We are changing the climate on Earth, and we need to live with the consequences. And now we know, we are much better informed, we know more details, but basically it's the same message. But these reports won't change the world. Transitions are seldomly knowledge-driven. I wish it was true. It's more about a deeper feeling of urgency. It's about emotions, it's about feelings. 32 years ago, we came with the same message. Now we are formulated in a more stringent manner. We only have until 2030 in order to avoid a real catastrophe. In July last year, we had major floods in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Germany. More than 20 years ago, we started a project. I was happy to work on that to broaden and deepen the rivers, the Meuse, for instance, and the Rhine. If we wouldn't have done it, and the last part of the project was finished 1 week before the floods, if we wouldn't have done it, we would have counted many more deadly victims. The message is, we thought that these floods would occur once in 100 years. Now we know that it's once out of 10 years. Every 10 years we might expect such a flood. The underlying message is we need to redirect, let's say, these rivers, and not only the rivers, but also the surrounding small rivers. And that's another major project. What about the climate goals that we formulated in Paris? I was there, it was very emotional, in 2015, December. Are we going to achieve the climate goals? Well, if we are honest, and some people ask me, don't be too honest in the media, but I need to be honest, 1.5 degrees is impossible. Because if we want to reach the 1.5 degrees, we should have seen now a decline of the global CO2 emissions. And we see a rising. And we expect another rise for the coming 5 years. Can we achieve 2 degrees? Still, but it's out of sight. We are heading for 3 degrees, if not more. We need to be realistic as well. But my message is, we need to fight for every 10th of degrees of Celsius. And not only today, but also tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. There's an imminent difference between 2.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. It means the difference between still having ice at the North Pole or not. Still having coral reef or not. So it's worth fighting for every 10th of degrees. This could have been my daughter. Or my granddaughter. She's not. I approached her. I gave a lecture there at the Malieveld in The Hague. There's a climate protest, was there around. I approached her and said, well, this is quite a statement. She said, well, you shouldn't take it literally. No, I'm not, but your generation has fucked it up, she said. That's painful. if you have been fighting for it for more than 37 years. But she's right. But we are not going to talk about it, she said. We will come back. Next week, next year, and the year after. That's a new generation. But I'm not going to leave this earth before I've done everything to avoid a climate catastrophe. I'm not the guy who wants to push it into the hands of the next generation. That is a lack of leadership. That's the reason why I once originated Urgenda. I came up with the name under the shower, urgent agenda, agenda things that needs to be done urgently right now. Together with Marjan Minnesma, we established this 15 years ago. We did many things. We became a little famous because we sued the state of the Netherlands. And we were the first globally to do that. And against all expectations, we won. And in higher appeal, we won. And in highest appeal. But the indirect impact of your actions is always bigger than the direct impact. That's what complex system science teaches you. So the indirect impact was that many people started the same kind of lawsuits. Now there are hundreds of these kind of lawsuits all over the world. In total, almost 2,000. Not always, let's say, related to this Urgenda lawsuit. But the indirect impact, that's one of the lessons I'm trying to convey today, is bigger than the direct impact. The great man behind that was Roger Cox. You see him left. He approached me almost 20 years ago. Jan, we need to win this climate fight in court. I didn't believe him, but we gave him the chance and he won. And he's now in Time magazine, the top 100 most influential people in the world. And then after that, he sued Shell. And I asked him, what the heck are you doing now? I'm working together with Shell in order to green it from inside. And you are going to put them into court? Yes. And he won again. And he has now another list of 40 companies, mostly multinationals. He is threatening again. It's not enough, let's say, to win this fight, but it helps, certainly. It helps. Tata Steel, I visited them recently. Wow. What's your legitimacy if you are still making people sick? If you are still producing, let's say, cancer-related output where people die from? So any company can be taken to court in the near future. That's a sign of chaos. What I expect is a wave, a series of waves. COVID, we all suffered from COVID, in particularly mentally, but also physically. It led to, let's say, an unevenly distributed global recession. But the climate crisis will be way more imminent. And then the nature crisis, because of the loss of biodiversity. Nature delivers us everything that we need. If we keep on destroying that, we are destroying ourselves. That's the second lesson I want to share with you. When I started doing climate change research, we were very concerned about the future of the earth and nature. Now, not so much anymore. Nature will survive anyhow, the earth also. But will we survive as humans? That's the question. That's at stake. The deepest cause of all these waves is the disbalance between humans and nature. We feel superior, we feel that we have the right to destroy nature. And if we keep on doing that, then nature strikes back in the form of a virus, in the form of a changing climate, in the form of loss of biodiversity. So deep down inside, it's a moral crisis. People tend to point at the economy, the capitalism. You know all the books where people put the blame on capitalism, on neoliberalism. That's too easy, because we created these systems and we all profited from it. So deep down inside, it's in ourselves. A part of us is greedy. A part of us is egoistic. And And the beginning of the solution and the ending as well is in our own behavior, our own social norms, our intrinsic values. So I wholeheartedly disagree with also the flourishing undercurrent in Belgium, the eco-modernist. I hate that, to put everything in the hands of technology, in particular nuclear energy, which is a fairy tale anyhow. And let's say, well, really underestimate the impact of our own behavior. I'll come back to that. This is the turning point in my story. I personally think that these crises are a blessing in disguise, because we are stubborn. We really hate to be changed, in particular in a fundamental way. So we learn mostly from crisis. And the pattern that we found is the following. After each systemic crisis, 5-10% of the people really is changing their behavior. And the rest is going back to business as usual. But after each crisis, it adds up. So what we see is a pattern that if we reach the tipping point, and the tipping point is not 50% of the people that changes their behavior, but 25%. The 25% is a kind of a magic number underpinned by many other colleagues as well. I found it, but also David Centola, the well-known American sociologist, found it. 25% means that the remaining 75% goes relatively fast, because then you are reaching the acceleration of the transition. And in my viewpoint, we are close to that tipping point. Close to that tipping point, at least in the Western world. And that is the hope, the sign of hope that I would like to convey today. Practical example, in the Netherlands, a little more than 20% of the households has solar panels. That took us about 35 years. I think within 10 years, we have a tripling or fourfold of the amount of households that has solar panels. And a lot has to do with social norms. If you have a suitable roof in 10 years from now and you don't have solar panels, then you are kind of a loser. In many, many respects. If you're still eating at McDonald's in 10, 15 years, that awful fast food, then you are kind of a loser. Social norms play a big role in these major transitions. If I would have stood here 40 years ago, almost everybody would have smoked. And smoking started with the 5-10% of people that refused to smoke because they read about the negative impacts of smoking on your health. They impact a larger group and they impact the mass. And then only after 30 years, the government came with restrictions. So many people think that that is government-driven. No, at the contrary. It was the change of our social norms, because if you are now smoking, then you are kind of a loser, isn't it? I'm sorry for those of you who still smoke. And that is what I always talk about, and many of my colleagues are doing now. We are with thousands of people in the transition communities, and I'm very proud of that, and I'm happy that I was among the first who started with it 25 years ago. A transition is not ordinary change, because that means that you are doing things more efficiently and smartly. But this is about a fundamental change in thinking, acting, and organizing. And these are embedded, of course, but the most difficult one is the fundamental change in thinking. You cannot force people to change in a different mode. You can only help them, stimulate them by conveying, let's say, insights, also knowledge, experiences, but it should be intrinsically motivated. And that's the reason why it takes usually decades. In my last book that I wrote together with Micha Verheijden, hopefully well known in Belgium, I laid out 10 different transitions. You all know about the energy transition, the resources transition is unfolding. It will be at least as important as the energy transition, the circular transition, the food transition, the space transition. But let's say my heart lies at the softer transitions in education, healthcare, and in society. And I called in my last book the democratic transition a kind of a prerequisite in order for successful energy and resources transition. I'm not going into detail with regard to this, but believe me, I'm starting a huge project with the harbor of Rotterdam on the resources transition. What is unfolding now? The next 10 years, there are about 40 million solar panels, there are thousands of windmills, there are thousands of accus coming on the market because they are replaced by more innovative and efficient ones. And what are we doing with this? We are putting them into the shredder, we are destroying them. That's the old linear economy. That has nothing to do with the circular economy. As long as we don't make solar panels that are recyclable or reusable, we are still far away from the circular economy. What are the buttons to push? I'm sorry, this is partly in Dutch, but there are 3 buttons to push with transitions. You have policies, you have technologies, and behavior. And in my last book, I put most emphasis on behavior. Social norms, let's say, are really, really important in order to influence the transition. In the year 2000, I launched a transition management, perhaps regrettable, because, well, you cannot manage a transition, but we needed to come with at least a word. And now we call it more transition governance, but what I mean with this is you need to look in a different way, you need to act in a different way, and you need to influence the course and direction and the pace of a transition in the most subtle way. I present very briefly 4 lenses. That's about different looking. We developed the development lens. Most people focus on the events from day to day. But for a transition, they are not so important. A transition is not the summing up of a day-to-day series of events. If you would apply it to Corona, you would look at the Chinese markets and the food production, that's fine. But what's more important are the let's say, changes from year to year. And even more important, the slow changes in the undercurrent from 10 years to 10 years. And these provide the seeds of fundamental change. And the optimism that I am, let's say, conveying to you today, settle down in the undercurrents of many, many systems. If you look at our relation with nature and animals, if you look at the intensive livestock and all these things, we need a drastic reorientation of that, and we see already the seeds of transformative change in the undercurrent. So please look beyond the day-to-day and year-to-year events. If you want to remain optimistic, look deeper into the seeds of transformative change. The second one is well known, the multi-time lens, also changed by my colleagues in the X-curve. And it says basically a transition is a non-linear process with a long pre-development and a long true development lens, and the most fascinating period is where we are now in, for many systems, the tipping point, the chaos phase. We all know the multi-scale lens, developed by Professor Adri Rip and applied by many, many other colleagues like Frank Geels. You need at least to look simultaneously at 3 different levels, macro, meso, and micro levels. And this is fascinating. When I started with this lens 20 years ago and applied it to the energy transition, you saw all kind of minuses. And a minus means that it hinders the energy transition. A plus means that it stimulates the energy transition. Now you see all kind of pluses, except for a few ones, in particular at the meso level, where we are struggling with how to steer that. So in 20 years, that really has changed. The steering lens we developed is kind of searching, learning, experimenting. Telling a big story, a vision, that's what we need in society, also in Belgium. Where's your big story? Where's your plan? You need a future orientation. I never ever research a transition out of pessimism or cynicism. You need positive energy, you need inspiration. So you need a kind of dot on the horizon. It's not a blueprint, because it will not happen, but you need a kind of long-term orientation. And then a strategy unfolding, let's say, quite a few transition pathways, then many experiments, then learning from it, again adjusting your vision. It's more a spiraling activity, and if it's done correctly, upwards and not downwards. We applied this in more than 20 countries, in more than 50 cities and regions, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, but we learned an awful lot. And it's still not being replaced by a better one, although I think it's deficient now and we need something more refined. What do I mean with embracing the chaos? First, we can expect much more chaos the next decade. Secondly, we need to deal with this chaos. We cannot avoid it any longer. We need to start from uncertainties and complexities. We do not, let's say, do not please try to control it and manage it. If you want to control and manage chaos, you get even more chaos. So you need to find a way to deal with it by searching and learning and translating this in scenarios and strategies. It requires planning. Most people think chaos does not require planning, but on the contrary. But you need not a command and control planning, but more an organic planning. So while you are planning, your goals are moving, and you need to steer based on everything that you learned underway on these pathways and experiments. So it's anticipating and adjusting to these changes. What helps is this kind of, let's say, typology. So chaos also arises from how we deal with structural uncertainties. This goes back to a well-known PhD of mine, Marjolein van Asselt, that also turned into a professor. It's more than 25 years ago. There are 4 kind of, let's say, structural uncertainties. Well, at least we start with the facts. Left below, things we know that we know, although in these days of fake news also disputed, but let's leave it this way. We have the white spots, the things we know that we don't know. How did COVID-19 arise? Exactly, we still don't know, but you can do more research and then you can resolve this. But most appealing to you are the black swans and the blind spots. The black swans go back to let's say, the idea of things we don't know that we don't know, Taleb. We always thought that swans were white until we discovered that they were black in the 17th century in Western Australia, discovered by, let's say, a Dutch traveler. 9/11 is an example, but most appealing perhaps are the blind spots, the things we don't know that we know. COVID-19 was a blind spot. I worked for 10 years within RIVM in the Netherlands, and I became a professor at the environmental side. At the human health side, there was Ab Osterhaus, a well-known virologist. And 30 years ago, he said, Jan, there will once be a global pandemic. And then I will be every week on television. Well, this is his moment of fame. He knew it. We all knew that there would come a pandemic once, but we ignored it. We know that we will run into a climate crisis, but we ignore it. So we know it, but we do not feel it. We do not really feel the urgency, and then we ignore it. COVID-19 was a part of every kind of, let's say, strategy in the Netherlands in terms of safety management. We ignored it. If we keep on ignoring these blind spots, we will run into the series of crises that I sketched. What can be then next blind spots? COVID-25. And it can even arise in the Netherlands because of the way we deal with nature here. 170 million animals we use for our food production. It's a shame. It's ridiculous. The internet can go down for 3 months. Last week in a college, a student said, that's impossible. I said, why? Well, then we cannot work anymore. I said, but that's not to say that it's impossible. Yeah, but we cannot believe that this is possible. That's exactly what I mean. We can expect a war on resources. We can expect a year of extreme drought. And what then? Are we prepared? No, we are not. The third part is about some nice examples about building with nature. The lesson from the first and the second part is that we need to do things together with nature, learning from nature in theory and practice. Also, at the primary and secondary schools. Don't give the students books about how nature functions, but let them experience the beauty of nature. Nature is not only efficient. All our society systems are efficient. Look at our healthcare systems. It's highly efficient, but it's not agile, it's not resilient. So nature is further in many respects than we are. In balance with nature is the starting point for our thinking, our acting, and our organizing. At least it should be. And then there are 10 times of different kind of growth. I'm, let's say, adherent and very supportive of regenerative growth. I know that there are many people now looking at degrowth, but I think that's a too simple concept and mechanism. Because in nature, you see an alteration of periods of growth, degrowth, let's say relatively silence, and then acceleration. And don't forget that the circular economy needs a kind of regenerative growth in order to step out the niches. Together with designers and architects, I have been thinking about the future of the Netherlands, and we call this a land with a plan, because so far we still don't have a plan. And the basis of it is designing and building with nature. This is the situation as we have now. And in 100 years from now, we expect, not in the sense that this is a blueprint, but if you look at all the developments, and let's say, and you introduce a kind of a paradigm shift, not only holding off the water and building more and higher dikes, but let the water in and try to live with the water, then you see you are splitting the country into two parts. The Randstad below zero and the Kantstad above zero. If we keep on doing like this, we expect in many parts of the western part, the Randstad, -8, -10. 8-10 meters below sea level. That means that holding the water off and putting it aside becomes too costly. We cannot afford that any longer. And that is the real paradigm shift. And yeah, this is close to where I live. So we have a famous part, the green heart that turns into the blue heart. And in order to show that, we have made a movie. I hope it works. Yes. In a couple of seconds, you fly above a possible, let's say, imagination of the Netherlands in the future. And that might also hold for Belgium and many other countries. But the whole world is looking at the Netherlands. What are these guys doing, lying so deeply below the sea level? You see here, it's a bit staggering, but the rivers need much more water than now. We have reduced the amount of agriculture by 50%, introduced more forest, more nature. We still can retain the Wadden Islands in the northern, but it will cost 20 times more sand suppletions than now. In the North Sea, a part of it is used for storage of energy and producing, in particular, wind and solar in relation to green hydrogen. You see that the whole coastline gets a different structure. We put Schiphol Airport in the North Sea, and the Haarlemmermeer we gave back to the water. We want to protect the major cities by ring dikes, but many polder areas will be filled with water for different kind of reasons. Well, it's not as elegant as I hoped because it's a little stagnating, but this is basically what we have been working on, and it already inspired many people. Some people found it very inspiring, some people found it threatening, some found it disgusting, but the the overall message is, if you look back 100 years, what are the major projects that we created? They took 20, 30, 40 years. If you look at the major challenges for energy, infrastructure, water, climate adaptation, we expect that it will cost 60, 70, 80 years. That means that you need to start the next 10 years with designing this plan. Within 10 years, we need to undertake action. Some images. This is a picture of Eindhoven in the future. Way more green. This is Amsterdam, O20 as we call it in Rotterdam. Much more green, much more space, let's say, for nature development. This is the famous Kinderdijk. Let's say there was a lot of resistance in the 17th century against these mills, these wood mills, and now millions of tourists visit them. In the future, you can do that by using your sub and small boat. And this is what we are working on in Rotterdam, moving with the tides. So the water will be rising, it's changing all the time, it's more natural to move with the tides than, let's say, to not do it, because then we are running into really catastrophes. This is part of an old harbor area that we're transforming slowly into a more nature-based place. This is an imagination of Rotterdam in the future. I know it's beautiful, but also awful. But at least, let's say, it is becoming much more attractive if you green it. This is one example of, let's say, the roofs that we are greening. We are front runner in the Netherlands. We're doing that. We are creating urban floodplains because, let's say, the sewage system, they suffer from, let's say, the extreme periods of rainfall that we are facing. So 3, 4, 5 times a year, they are flooding. We are front runner in terms of climate adaptation, not mitigation, but adaptation. So we are creating playgrounds where 3, 4 times a year these are flooded. You need to do it together with the people because there was quite a lot of resistance. We learned a lot from it. We are trying to build things on the water, sometimes in a rather awkward manner. I laid the foundation for this floating pavilion that's being replaced now. Floating houses, we have kind of 20 already. This is a UN building in one of our old harbor areas. The climate adaptation, the UN group is formed here, and a nice restaurant. It's a floating office. This is kind of ridiculous, but I very much love it. This is a floating farm where the cows now and then jump into the water. But it can be extended globally if you imagine that 80% of the people live in delta areas in 100 years from now. Well, solar panels, I hate that we put them on agricultural ground or natural ground. That's the old linear economy. Profit from it. It doesn't matter where you lay them down. I'm much more supportive on using, let's say, the front walls and the roofs, using the water for the solar panels along, let's say, the roads and also where the train rails go. So this is a part of a sustainable road in the Netherlands. It's 20 kilometers. We created an energy wall. So it's energy positive, basically. The point is, it took 6 years to realize it, together with also digital innovations. That means if you want to, let's say, adjust all the roads in the Netherlands, it might take 450 years. This is what I like now. That's very fastly unfolding, so building with wood. We are also stimulating that. There's a lot of resistance because transitions are always power plays. So building with wood and biomass is, let's say, way more sustainable than using concrete. It can act as a major carbon sink. We are planning to build another 1 million houses in the Netherlands the next 10 15 years. If we do that by wood, but then we need to do it using European production wood, we can save 100 megaton of CO2. That's about a quarter of everything that we produce. So the, let's say, carbon sink in the built environment can be as high as the carbon sink in the industry. That's mostly underrated. This is a circular building designed by Thomas Rau. It's the renaissance of an existing building. 80% of the old building is reused. Each material has its own passport. It's beautiful. Only 0.003% of our buildings is circular. We have about 25 of them out of 1 million buildings. So we talk about circular building, but in practice, it's only minor. To round off, what can you do as an individual, as a professional? Well, I have some advice for you. First of all, we are the problem and the solution. Don't blame the systems. We are the system. That is, let's say, always the contingency. We created the systems, and the systems have conditioned us. It goes back to Giddens already, and Luhmann. It's always a co-evolution. In times of chaos, systems become vulnerable, and you can profit from that. If you have the right intervention at the right moment, you can have a major impact. When I was 20, 25, there was overall stability. There were equilibria. Now, in times of chaos, you can profit from it. Within your household, within your university, within your company, you can profit from the chaos. This is the time of the movements. The divestment movement became quite successful the past 10 years. It all started with a group of 20 students that visited a coal mine at an American university. And it turned out that the coal mine was a major sponsor of their university, and it spread it like a kind of a virus. The ocean cleanup movement is the fastest growing movement in the world. The climate movement, of course. In times of chaos, individuals and small groups of people can make a significant difference. The ocean cleanup movement started with Bojan Slat, who used to be a diver and, let's say, was shocked by the amount of plastic that he saw. Greta Thunberg, we all know her. Jos de Blok, quite famous in the Netherlands for making healthcare more human-oriented. Marjan Minnesma, with whom I initiated Urgenda. So you can make a difference in times of chaos. It all comes back to leadership. In a period of chaos and instability, leadership from different kind of values is needed. From passion, trust, integrity, and visionarity. For me, a leader is authentic and connecting. I was a fan of Angela Merkel, standing upright in the storm. Of course, she was wrong in a number of cases, but at the time it was storming, she stood right up. We don't have such a leader in the Netherlands. We have a prime minister who is really pleading for action, action, action. And he was in Glasgow, and there came an action proposal, and then he said, yeah, we are demissionary, so we cannot join this action proposal. And he needed to change that within 2 days because of the pressure from society. That's not the kind of leadership that we are asking for. You can do also in your personal life a lot. Become part of a relevant movement. Join a particular action group. Initiate your own action group. At my own university, there are students now who are trying to transform the education system, because still 80% of the students at my own university are not confronted with the basic knowledge on sustainability and transitions. It's hard to believe, but that's the reality. Influence the people in your own environment. All kind of research shows that angriness is very effective if you transform that in positive change. Change your own lifestyle, become a flexitarian, be aware of your clothes, possess less stuff, travel by train rather than by airplane, spoil less food and energy. You all know that. And we are on the verge of this kind of, let's say, change in our behavior. It is feasible. Don't let you blow away by all kind of cynics. In 25 years, we can make this happen. We have the elements. We all have the elements that we need. We have the knowledge, we have the expertise, we have the power, we have the institutions. And technically, everything is already possible. And there's a lot of technological innovation underway still. So if we really want this, if we will not achieve this, apparently we didn't really want it. And that is my plea to you. Step into the arena. I don't ask you to put the world on your shoulders. I don't ask you to have no more fun. I don't ask you to raise money. I only ask you to stand up and step into the arena. And I'm finishing with the famous last word, spoken out more than 100 years by the American President Roosevelt. It's called the man in the arena. Nowadays you would phrase it the man or woman in the arena. Read it with me, because it always inspires me and makes me always a bit emotional, because I recognize myself. It's not the critic that counts, because the critic is standing outside the arena. The critic belongs to the man or woman who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust, sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasm and great devotion, who spends him or herself in a worthy case, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst at least fails by daring greatly, so that his or her place shall never be with those who neither know victory nor defeat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rotmans, for this inspiring story on societal changes, on greening cities with nature-based solutions, and of course of what we all can do as from now. We have now room for a few questions. My colleagues told me that online we don't have a question, but maybe there's someone in the room having a question for Professor Rotmans. I'll just do like this because the lights are very strong. No. Yeah, over there. There it is.
Is it working? Yeah. Well, thank you for this very great presentation. Allow me to potentially disagree with you on one specific element, which is the fact that egoism is potentially a main driver for not changing. I think that very often it's that people feel helpless. We have this concept of learned helplessness. People look at very complex situations, they don't know what to do. We very often, as educated people, we are able to see these patterns, we are able to see solutions, but a lot of people don't. So very often isn't also the solution going to people, talking to people, listening to them, and showing empathy with regard to what they potentially don't know or what they misunderstand?
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. Let me nuance it in two ways. I said a basic mechanism behind unlimited growth is our egoism, because that part always wants to have more and more and more. That is the mechanism, but the point is, a part of us is egoistic, a part of us is also altruistic. We need other people, we need to work together with them. So I didn't blame every part of us, but a part of it, I think you agree with me, drives the tendency towards almost unlimited growth. Secondly, the system transitions that I was talking about require a personal transition. I didn't mention it explicitly, but in my last book, I devoted a whole chapter on that personal transition. And many people are in different stages of that personal transition. I agree with you that quite a few people need to be helped because they realize that they want to do things differently, but how? That's if you are in the very first phase of your personal transition, but there are also people who are, let's say, in a later phase of the personal transition. They know what they should do, they are acting already upon it, and in the later phase of the transition, because I applied the same kind of S-curve to that, there are people who are helping others with that personal transition. So at least we need to distinguish different kind of groups with different kind of mechanisms in different kind of phases of the personal transitions. And there I think we can find each other. The helpless people can be helped by the people who are able to help others. Therefore, I always plead for connectors, not only frontrunners, but connectors, people who connect other people, other ideas, other projects. Connectors in this phase of chaos are really, really valuable. So there was a lot of knowledge that I didn't share, but still the case if I get many more of these kind of good questions.
Yeah, I mean, you just returned, but the neighbor has also a question.
I cannot even see them, but I try to imagine, yeah.
Thank you, Professor Rotmans, for inspiring presentation. You delve into the sea level rise, and Dutch are famous with that, so you try to protect yourselves. And what is your assessment? Because some people talk about 1 meter, 2 meter by end of the century, but some important scientists say that this can be the multi-meter sea level rise. So what is your opinion and let's say, the assessment? What should be waiting for within, let's say, one generation?
Well, before I try to answer that, it's good to emphasize that I introduced a kind of a paradigm shift. That we became famous because we built the best water defense system in the world. And that is not future-proof. That's my basic message. Because I, in my future vision, started from 1 meter sea level rise in 2121. But we started already 2 years ago. After the latest IPCC reports, in particular from Working Group 2 and 3, we need to adjust that. 1 meter in 100 years is possibly too low. In the latest assessment, we go to 1.5, 2 meters in the next 100 years. But even more interestingly, it doesn't stop after 100 years. Let's say in 300 years, the latest assessments indicate that we should deal with 3, 4, 5 meters. Well, then it's impossible to, let's say, protect yourself by still only raising and strengthening the dikes. Then you need to accept that either you need to leave a major part of the country and fly to higher areas like Germany, but that was not so much appealing, and at least not in my opinion. Or try to reorient yourself and try to live with and on the water. So with floating districts, floating cities, floating railways, floating agriculture. But we need to be honest about this. Every NIL study indicates that, let's say, the general assessments of the expected sea level rise goes faster and higher. Yeah, that is worrisome. We never ever have seen this in history. Of course we have seen it, but over a much longer period. But then it took 10,000s, if not millions of years, but not within 100 or 200 years. So in the latest IPCC report, literally, the scientists said, can humans adjust themselves to this fast change? That's the question. Nature is more resilient and agile than we are. So yes, that's, and when I go back to my PhD in 1990, I didn't get cum laude because it was highly controversial. I developed the first integrated climate assessment model in the world, IMAGE. It's still being used. It has been used in all the climate negotiations, so I'm a bit proud of that. Because my committee said, perhaps you have been doing fascinating research into a problem that might not exist in 30 years from now. And my estimates for the sea level rise were seen as ridiculously high, and now with the knowledge we have, it goes 2-3 times faster than I thought 32 years ago. That's reality. And I always bet on bottles of whiskey. So I went to some members of that committee and I asked them for a bottle of whiskey because that was the bet at that time. I have now 90 in my cellar. So if you visit Rotterdam and come by, please, I cannot drink them on my own anymore. I think a little bit of humor is important. People always ask me, how do you remain optimistic? Well, a little bit of humor helps, but also zooming out. If you're only zooming in, it always goes slow, it never goes fast enough. But if you zoom out, if I look back 35 years ago, there have been a tremendous change. With all the climate plans that were set into motion, we avoided about 2 degrees more warming if we wouldn't have taken these measures. So don't forget that. If I talked about climate change 32 years ago, I didn't even mention the word. I talked about the CO2 problem. Then later on the greenhouse problem and then the climate change problem. So in the awareness, in the attitude, also in the behavior, tremendous change has been taken. Fortunately, it's still by far not enough, but don't forget all the change that has come on our way. So please remain optimistic. It never was achieved by pessimism, never ever. And even if we are wrong, do everything that you can. Other questions, I hope.
I think this will be the last question. I'm sorry, I didn't see that yet. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Rotmans, for a really inspiring presentation. And I'd like to ask a question on the level playing field. You mentioned earlier leadership, but look, small steps, of course, are needed. And as you mentioned, don't blame the system. We are the system. But you know, meat tastes good, and flying places is fun, and riding a fast car or driving a car is comfortable. You know, like it's difficult to move outside of that mentality. And as you mentioned before about smoking of course takes small steps, but at a certain point, government steps in and levels the playing field. And could you maybe mention a few words about at what point, how do we get that level playing field so that even though logically, cognitively, we understand that there are problems that we just are plainly incapable of acting on because we don't feel comfortable that there is a level playing field?
Okay, good question, although I cannot see you, but I imagine you are in the room. First of all, there's no such thing as a level playing field. So I hardly use this term. It's a bit naive. A transition is always a power shift. So there is a group that has the power, we call it the regime, and there is a group that wants to have the power, the niches. And the niches mostly form after a period also a kind of niche regime and then want to take over the power. So it's not about the good guys and the bad guys. Well, you will see in 10, 20 years that the niches in the, let's say, energy transition have taken over the power. But then, in 30, 40 years from now, they also are taken over. So that's the evolutionary part of a revolution. Secondly, if you look at the mechanisms that the fossil fuel regime has, they still have an advantage. Most of the subsidies go to the fossil fuel regime. Most of the laws and rules are standing in the way of a new economy. In the Netherlands, we still have 20 laws and rules that are at odds with the circular economy. For instance, we still have a waste law that prohibits reusing waste. And that was introduced 50 years ago because waste was seen as damaging for the environment. So that also needs a reorientation. But my point was, you are associating, let's say, human behavior and change in norms with small steps. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think we are with many. We are with dozens of millions of people who are undertaking already these small steps, and it adds up to a big step. I've given you the example of the transition from smoking to non-smoking. That lasted 50 years. And the most decisive part was the change in our social norms. I sometimes make the joke, my mother was pregnant from me when she still smoked. So my son said, there it all went wrong. Yes, okay. But if you are now pregnant and you would be smoking, that's almost seen as criminal. And you see in the undercurrent the signs that are similar. Eating meat. But also, let's say, 10 years ago, it was still fancy if you say, I'm flying to New York for a weekend, have a lot of fun, going to parties and back. Think about flying. That's also seen in a different mode. Our social norms with regard to flying are changing slowly, gradually, but unmistakably. Eating meat, I've given you already the examples. Spoiling energy. There's an explosion of people in Belgium and the Netherlands that wants to take measures now because they don't want to be dependent of Putin and pay indirectly Putin. So they want to insulate their houses. So in the undercurrent, you find the signs of hope. And you might consider the small changes, but because we are part of networks, ecosystems, it can go quite fastly. Paul Polman used to be the CEO of Unilever. He once said, an arbitrary group of consumers can lay down our company within 24 hours. Fortunately, they are not aware of the potential power they have. So in my book, I called it the illusion of being powerless. And your question also goes a bit into that direction. That formulation came from Flor Avelino, a very good PhD of mine. She wrote a beautiful PhD on the relations between power and transitions. And she said most people suffer from the illusion of being powerless. So if people would realize how powerful they really are, then we can manage this within 20, 25 years. And that's the reason why I came here. To activate you and make you aware of the potential power that you have within your own ecosystem, but also globally. The indirect impact of your actions is mostly bigger than the direct impact. So that's my last plea. I think you need a lunch now.
Yes, to be
and I'm
powerful.
going to the University of Antwerpen.
Thank you very much.
To inspire the students.
Okay.
But I was happy to be here. I feel one with you. Go on with all your beautiful work. And, well, you are in my heart, hopefully also vice versa. Thank you very much.
Thank you.